Welcome to the Encore Audio Archives YouTube channel. I'm Taper Dave, and this is my channel. I've uploaded hundreds of talks here that I've recorded at meetings in West LA, and I've also recorded conventions starting in 2013. I've got a bunch of those up. And Walt and Mary Murray, the original owners of Encore Audio Archives, started the company in the 80s, and Walt recorded Joe and Charlie's and a bunch of stuff down in Vista, California. My sobriety date is June 20th of 1994. I hope you find something you like, so please like and subscribe to my channel and comment down below. If you want to hear something that I don't have or that you don't see, I'll see that I get it. Anyways, take care and have a great day if you want to.
I gave your wife the $100. Good evening. My name is Kay Langen, and I'm an alcoholic. Do you feel the love, the feeling, the fellowship, the caring about one another in these rooms? Isn't it awesome? I can remember days when I couldn't even get people to call me. Your committee is reaching out of the speaker's sandbox because this is the second time I've done this. And I want to thank the committee for asking me to come to Minneapolis and speak. The committee did inform me that if you weren't satisfied with my talk, they would refund your money when you went out the door. Did we talk about that earlier?
Yes, we did.
Yes, we did. Yes. Speaking always seems like a good idea months before when they call you and you accept and you're in your house all by yourself. I came into this room tonight and I looked at all these eyeballs and I went, oh my goodness, let's rethink that. When I came into this program, I was told when Alcoholics Anonymous asks anything of you, you will say yes, because you owe your life to Alcoholics Anonymous. The second reason is that as long as that I've been kicking around these meetings, conferences, and roundups, I'm beginning to like fruit baskets and gift bags. The telephone number for, I like gift bags a little better than fruit baskets, if any of you out there are thinking about me again. A month ago, I was in the Big Belt Mountains of Montana trail riding. As I was sitting on my mare taking in the view, mountains that reach altitudes of 10,000 feet, valleys, trees, babbling creeks. There was probably a few crooks there, too. I said to my higher power, hey, God, want me to tell you how important I am? I want to tell you something. My ego stood in awe in the mountains. Not only was trail riding on the agenda, but the benefit of a clinician teaching you about your horse. Ray Hunt, a respected horse clinician, said, you gotta give something you never gave in order to get something you've never had. That, ladies and gentlemen, sums up my Alcoholics Anonymous program. Mike Goyen, the outfitter for this trail ride, was sitting on the porch one afternoon and we were talking as we were drinking coffee. Now you have to get this picture. Here's a man that's made his living his entire life by his hands and his back. And he's sitting there, and he rode bulls in the PRCA when he was younger. Mike's saying that he is comprised of 4 parts: physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional, and that he needs to stay in touch with all 4 parts to be a whole person. I went charging up to the cabin and brought my book, Simple Abundance, down, and I had to show him the May 2nd reading, and I'd like to quote that to you. There is an Indian proverb that says, everyone is a house with 4 rooms, a physical, a mental, an emotional, and a spiritual. Most of us tend to live in one room most of the time, but unless we go into every room every day, even if only to keep it aired, we are not a complete person. I would like to share with you a few of my ideas on the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was told I had a physical, mental, and spiritual disease upon arrival, and I had absolutely no idea what that meant. However, the one thing that I did know about myself was I never felt imbalance. I always felt like one of the other parts of me was at a different level. After being in the program, I discovered the reason for those feelings was physically, mentally, and spiritual parts of me were out of sync. Step one, we admit we were powerless over alcohol. That, to me, plays three important roles. We admit we're alcoholic. That's physical. And we are bringing the body to the program. Then we accept we are alcoholic. That's mental. And we start thinking about somebody else besides ourselves. Next, we surrender to the fact that we are alcoholic, and that's spiritual. That's when we begin having a relationship with our higher power. Now, my day begins with a spiritual prayer and meditation, usually about 5 a.m. And then the physical part of my day begins as I take care of the horses, dogs, and cats that allow me to share the same area of terra firma that they inhabit. If I ever wonder if I'm alcoholic, all I need to do is walk around my acreage. I have a 3/4-ton Dodge diesel pickup to pull a 3-horse slant trailer. The cost of this rig is approximately $42,000. All this to haul around a $1,000 horse. They also told me when I come into this program and I start to go through a dry drunk, or God forbid a slip, which stands for sobriety loses its priority, the exact opposite happens to me. I quit talking to God. There goes my spiritual connection. Mentally, I begin feeling sorry for myself, and then I'm in the bar, taking that first drink and wondering what happened. I've talked to enough people who have experienced slips, and I've learned a couple of things. One, they never could get a connection to their higher power. Two, they quit talking to their higher power. Our book tells us that God does not make it too difficult for those who honestly seek him. My sobriety date is either 20, 21, 22 December 1975. Who the heck remembers? I came into our program by way of a 9-step call. When I arrived at my first meeting, my sponsor, who I did not select but was told who she was sitting there. Her name was Agnes Doherty, and she went to the big meeting in the sky in April of 1981. In 1975, there were not that many women sober in Sioux Falls, probably around 20. What can I say about Agnes? I didn't like her. She was not warm and fuzzy, but the woman saved my life. Sponsorship has changed over the last 30 years. I call sponsorship today touchy-feely. Oh, I hurt your feelings? Please let me rephrase that to be politically correct. Agnes was not my best friend. She wasn't supposed to be. That's not what a sponsor does. Sponsorship tells you the truth when you do not want to hear it. Sponsorship guides. They talk, and you listen. Today, I've observed newcomers coming in, talking for 20 or 30 minutes, rambling on and on about nothing. When I came into the program, it was quite common to hear your sponsor say, "You sit down and shut up because you don't know anything." Or, "Take the cotton out of your ears and stuff it in your mouth." My very first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting was at the Brandon 12 and 12 in what they called the Pump House in October of 1975. Jim picked me up, and when we arrived, it was so smoky I couldn't see you sitting across the room from me. The person reading How It Works stumbled over every other word. And when the meeting was over with, this lady that was to be my sponsor looked at me and said, "Do you want a cookie?" I said, "No, thank you, I don't eat sweets." She said, "You will if you're alcoholic." At that time, I had no idea that alcohol metabolizes as sugar when the body breaks it down. Believe me, that statement did not endear her to me. I thought to myself, you know, Cupcake, I really haven't declared myself to be one of you. So when Jim drove me home that night, I and all of my ultimate wisdom said, "Jim, I think I got a handle on this. I won't drink during the week. I'll eat a pound of butter before imbibing." So after getting drunk numerous times from October to the middle of December, I called Jim and said, "You know, I think I'd like to come back to those meetings." He said, "That's fine, but we've moved to a new building." It's a double-wide trailer house behind the VFW in Brandon. The night I went back, guess who was sitting there? You got it. Agnes Doherty. I've come to the conclusion that sponsors are like hawks. They can see their prey from 100 feet up in the air. She knew every move I ever made. I didn't tell her what I had done. She'd done it. I didn't have to tell her how I felt. She felt it. So Agnes would sit and listen to me commiserate about how difficult my life was and how things never went my way because it was always someone else's fault. My family, my job, my boss, and when all that failed, God was a good one to blame because he don't fight back. If he would have given me a different life, if he'd have given me different parents, if I was educated, if I made more money, the if-onlys. Agnes looked at me and said, emotions are wonderful servants, but they're terrible masters. Agnes gave me many gifts of knowledge. Another gift was when I got up in the morning to get down on my knees and ask my higher power to help me stay sober that day. When I went to bed that night to get down on those same knees and ask your higher power for one more day of sobriety. I guarantee you, if you do those two things for 2 weeks, something is going to happen in your life. Why on your knees? Do you realize that was in the original 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, but they took it out because they felt that people who had some bad experiences with religion would balk at it? But the reason she suggested I do it on my knees is you tell me what you are in charge and control of when you are on your knees. When I sobered up, it was quite common to hear the floor-to-knee ratio. I sobered up with a lot of construction workers, and I remember this one young man saying he just could not get down on his knees and talk to his higher power. An old-timer at the meeting looked at him and said, hell, son, that's easy. Tomorrow morning when you get up, throw your 24-hour book underneath the bed, and when you're on your knees to retrieve it, start talking. You know, as human beings, we like to believe that we are in control of a lot of circumstances in our lives, but the reality of the situation is the only person I can control is myself. Agnes also informed me my higher power designed me as a 24-hour person, and that means that I don't bring the guilt of yesterday and the fear of tomorrow into today, because when I do that, I'm ruining the only thing I have, and that is this 24 hours. I have a choice of how I'm going to live over this 24 hours. I was pretty puffed up one day when Agnes and I were having coffee. I informed her that I was going out to visit relatives a couple of 100 miles west of the ranch country of South Dakota. For those of you that have never drank West River, I'm here to tell you there is never less than a case of anything and usually 2 of everything. In my newfound sobriety and all of my intelligence, I informed Agnes that if I drank, she wouldn't know. She promptly informed me that it didn't make any difference if she knew. I would. You know, that was the first time in my life somebody stood there and told me that I was accountable. Now, for years, it had been easy to blame others. Now, I'm accountable. Agnes asked me to give this program 1 year to do the things they had found to be successful as a way of life. If at the end of that year's time I wanted to go back out, they were still going to be making my favorite brand of booze. In a conversation with Agnes one day, I discovered that a few years back she had sponsored a cousin of mine named Joanne. Joanne was a Skid Row drunk, and I remember asking Agnes why she couldn't get the program, and Agnes said because she could never get honest with herself. There are 3 beginnings we have to make. Get a connection with our higher power, that's spiritual. Get honest with ourselves, that's mental. Become willing, that's physical. Hanging on 5 minutes at a time, staying sober when our bodies, minds, and spirits are crying to be anesthetized. The Brandon group, where sobriety began, had approximately 10 people come in through the doors in 1975, and I was the end gate. On my 3-month birthday, there were 3 of us celebrating. At 6 months, 2, and at 1 year, it was I. During that summer, I remember Gene F., who celebrated 6 months with me, had a slip. He came back to the meeting saying that on his Canadian fishing trip, they were passing around the beer, and he thought, why not? I remember thinking, oh God, if he can't do it, I can't do it. But Syl was sitting across the table from him, and I had spent many an hour around Jan and Syl's table, drinking coffee, talking program. My next conscious thought was, Syl, if you go, I'm gone. Well, Sil stayed sober, I stayed sober, and in a couple of years, Gene returned to our fold and stayed sober until he went to the big meeting in June of last year. I need to share with you a couple of stories about Jan and Sil. At this time, I was hauling kids out West River Memorial Day and Labor Day weekend for the Medicine Creek Trail Ride. Jan and Sil's son, Thad, was about 12. And at that time, I asked if he'd like to accompany Scott, 15, and I on this ride. He did. Sil is a typical alcoholic when it comes to procrastination. The plan was, and oh, it is so dangerous when two alcoholics have a plan. We were going to move Thad's horse from Garrettson over to Scott's place by Crooks at about 35 miles, so we'd be ready to load and go the following morning. Now we do this in a pickup with stock racks. Jan told us before we left that she had baked a cake, and when we came back, the coffee would be on. We pull out of the yard about 9 p.m., are within 2 miles of Scott's, and we have a flat tire. Now it is a nice warm evening. Stars are out. And I said to Sil, "You got a spare?" "Yep, it's in the back." He proceeded to unload the horse, saddle her up, puts the bridle on, steps into the saddle, moves the horse over the fender of the pickup and says, "Get on." I take it we don't have a spare. That's right. So as we were riding down the road, Sil says, "She ain't doing too bad for a mare that's never been broke to ride double." We ride into Scott's yard, put the horse away, and Scott gives us a ride back over to Sil's. We pull into their yard about 11 p.m. No cake and coffee here. At the next meeting, when I saw Jan, I merely stated, "I thought you were going to have coffee and cake for us when we got back." Her response was a typical Al-Anon one. "I've waited up for enough drunks in my life. I ain't going to do it anymore." The second story about Jan I'd like to share with you. The first meeting we go to, we were always a bit apprehensive, and Jan was no exception. At our first Al-Anon meeting, the speaker made her realize immediately she was home, because the speaker said, "It's a good thing God doesn't answer prayers, or we'd all be widows." This is part of my story that I'm not proud of sharing, but it is my life. The Brandon group had 2 meetings a week, Monday and Thursday. Then on Saturday nights, couple would attend the various speakers' meetings out and for coffee afterwards. Dale's wife decided Al-Anon wasn't for her, so she quit attending after a couple of meetings. But Dale still went to the regular meetings and also on Saturday nights. When it came to the seating arrangements at restaurants, it went husband-wife, Dale K. This relationship escalated into affair. If mentally we are at the age that we began drinking, I'm 18. My thought was, marriage is like roommates. If things aren't working, change them. The affair lasted for 2 years, and Dale went back to drinking, and I was close to going back out. Dale and Deanne have 4 daughters and a son. At this time, the kids were in high school and grade school. The first person I shared any emotions with coming into the program was an Al-Anon lady named Helen, and she had terminal cancer. One night, I was sitting in her house telling her about my newfound love. She looked at me with pain-filled eyes and said, "Kay, people are going to get hurt." And I remember thinking, yeah, but it ain't going to be me. How arrogant is that thinking? Guess what? Everybody gets hurt in situations like mine. Now, for some reason, my higher power believes I should come face to face with the wreckage of my past. Our relationship is over. Dale's drinking, and I've changed jobs, and am now working for the South Dakota Air National Guard full-time. Kevin, Dale's son, joined the unit, and shortly afterwards was employed full-time also. As they were taking him around to the various sections to introduce the new hire, I could tell by his eyes he knew who I was. If he answered the phone when I would call his section, he was always professional. If we passed in the hall, there was a short nod. A few years passed, and one Sunday in the winter, I was reading the Sunday paper. Now, I never read the divorce section, but I did this day, and I saw Dale and Deanne's divorce in there. My first thought was, "Deanne, why now when you hung on for so long?" Shortly, a letter arrived from the state treatment center. It was from Dale. Alcohol had taken everything material from him, and he was reduced to living in his pickup. His daughter Kay would check up on him from time to time, and eventually it was she who got him admitted to the state program. Now here is where the insanity of alcoholism meets the idealism of the feminine. Dale re-enters my life, and on November 11th, 1989, we were married. My script reads, with me by his side, he would stay sober. With my understanding of alcoholism, how could it fail? And we would become Mr. and Mrs. AA. Nobody reads my script. I learned quickly there is a difference in my alcoholism and someone you love's alcoholism. If he managed to get 48 hours of sobriety, I gave him all of the 14 years that I had, at the hope that this time it's really going to work. Did I handle his drinking with the understanding of an alcoholic? Absolutely not. I did everything an Al-Anon does. I reacted instead of acted. I ended up running to Al-Anon, and Sharon W. and the women of the Parker Group saved my sanity. I had changed AA groups when I moved to my current home. Was our relationship all bad? Of course not. For my 50th birthday, Dale planned a surprise birthday party and was proud that he had pulled it off. In March of 1993, he walked out, and I had to deal with a farm auction and 105 acres of land. Dale's two sisters and their husbands, who are farmers, came over and lined up the equipment and helped me with the sale. Dale's sister Karen once said to me, "My brother was a jerk, but you know, he must have done something right. He married the two best women in the world." June of 1993, Dale and I were legally divorced. My story isn't really interesting. I've not been to jail, although I've spent a total of 32 years in the United States military, and some may equate them as similar. I never lost a job or had a DUI. But I'd like to share with you times when my higher power has interceded in my life, when I've asked and when I haven't asked. December 1993, the South Dakota, Iowa, Virginia, and Colorado Air National Guard were planning a deployment to Turkey. The personnel to man this trip were to be selected from the aforementioned units. Places I've never traveled before intrigued me, and I really wanted this trip. My boss informed me that I wasn't needed on this trip. I'm driving home from work after being told no, and you know how an alcoholic likes that word. So I'm telling my higher power how I feel, and I'm saying, you know, God, I really wanted to go on that trip. And I think I must have stated it mentally 2 or 3 times. And this feeling comes over me as if to say, you're going. And it was so strong, I responded to this feeling in the only way that I knew how, and I said, God, even you can't change the South Dakota Air National Guard's mind. Left it be at that, figured I'd had the last word of that conversation. Well, a few days later, I'm sitting in my office. I knew my boss had gone down to Sioux City to tweak the Manning document. When he returned, he walked into my office, looked at me, and said, "Do you still want to go to Turkey?" My response was, "I would love to go to Turkey." He said, "We need a documentation person, and if you want it, the slot is yours." Driving home that night, I'm about as humble as any human being can be as I apologize to my higher power, but only in the alcoholic way. Okay, God, I wouldn't put that up there with the parting of the Red Sea, but that was a miracle. Never in my wildest imagination did I know that was going to be an AA sabbatical. On the trip over, Wally G. from Sioux City unit and Jeff H. from my unit were in the program. After settling in, Wally informed me where the AA meetings were held and the times. My first meeting, I was introduced to the only other woman named Jeannie, and she was permanent party. My plan, and you know how God chuckles when we make plans, was to make a meeting a week like I do at home. One night after work, I'm walking down to the commissary when a car comes along blowing its horn and pulling over the curb. Well, it's Jeannie. She says, "Where are you going?" "Commissary." "Me too. Get in." After we finish our shopping and are back in the car, she says, "We can make it to a meeting if you want to go." Okay, so we take in a meeting, and afterwards as we're driving, she says, "You want to go get something to eat?" Okay. So down to the alley we go. The alley is where the Americans did all their shopping and eating off base. I find out Jeannie is married to a Turkish national, and his family owns a restaurant on the alley. As we were driving back on base after supper, Jeannie says, "Well, as long as you're here, I might as well do my 5th step." My mind is going, "Oh, God, what do we do do now? And my voice says, I believe we can handle that. The meetings were like in the Blue Book. If we weren't working, we were together. Some of the permanent party had apartments off base, and when there wasn't a meeting, we were sitting at their table, talking program and drinking chai. A couple of weeks after our arrival, I was in my office and the planes were landing. The radios were on ground frequency. Base operations in my work area could listen to the pilots talk. When I hear one of the pilots ask the lady in ops if she wanted to catch a beer later, she informed him that she didn't drink. This lady was in Wally's unit, so I asked him if she was a program person. Now, Wally is big on anonymity, and he said, you ask her. I had to think about this. 2 women and 1 AA group. You know what happens when you add 3 of anything to a group? It throws it out of kilter. And I wasn't ready for out of kilter. I'm running these thoughts through my mind when this thought comes to the forefront of my mind as clear as a bell. I am always inclusive. I am never exclusive. I walk over to the following day, on my afternoon break, I walk over to the ops building, and a woman is behind the counter. I asked, are you Leslie? She looked at me and said, yes. I said, could I talk to you outside? So we walk outside, and sitting at a picnic table, I asked, are you a friend of Bill Wilson's? Nope, never heard of the guy, she said. Well, I could tell I wasn't getting anywhere with this secret code. I had to go direct. I said, are you in Alcoholics Anonymous? Yes, I am, was her response. I told her we have meetings and gave her the days and the times. Leslie told me a couple of weeks later, the night before I came to talk to her, she got down on her knees on her cot in Tent City and said, God, if something doesn't happen, I'm going to drink. The next day, God's little diligent helper showed up. Leslie added a lot to our group, and I'm proud to call her friend. There were 3 men who came into recovery during this time. 2 are still sober, and 1 went back out. One of the 3 is named Russ. Now, Russ is quiet, and he came to the meeting, and one night he got up during the meeting and left. I thought it was work-related, but found out later he'd gone back out. Christmas Day of 1993, we all gathered together for supper at Howard's apartment in downtown Adana. There were 3 Turkish national present who were using the AA program for sobriety. At that time, there were 100 sober Turkish people in their entire country. They didn't speak English, but we had an interpreter present. After a fabulous meal and an impromptu AA meeting, I will never forget what Leslie said. This is a year I learned the real meaning of Christmas. Russ didn't make it to our Christmas party because he was practicing. But the next day, after the morning meeting, we went over to the BX to the Baskin Robbins for ice cream. We are talking, laughing, and having a good time when I see a guy a few tables away reading a newspaper and trying to hide behind it. I said to Dave, isn't that Russ over there? Yep. I said, shouldn't one of you guys go over there and invite him back to the meetings? He said, we are. We're just going to let him suffer a little bit more. Russ returned to our program on the 26th of December, 1993, and has been living our way of life ever since. Larry also sobered up in Turkey, and he was walking with me one night after we left a meeting, and he said, Kay, I like your program. I was wondering if you'd do my 3rd step with me. We went to my room and lit some candles and proceeded to do the 3rd step prayer. Those Air Force kids, they were kids to me, tapped me for everything I knew. I celebrated my 18th birthday in December of 1993, and unbeknownst to me, they had no 18-year medallion to give me. So Dave got on the phone to his sponsor in Germany, and they got one in time for my birthday. I could have informed them the best birthday present was a privilege of getting to know them and to be a part of such a wonderful group. God, I got a lot of story, don't I? That's what happens when you get old. Before leaving for Turkey, my ex-husband stopped by my place. He was skin and bones and under the influence of alcohol. As I looked at him standing there, I was seeing only the shell of a man because everything human had been removed. Computers are electronic marvels, and emails from the States flowed freely The time difference usually meant that we were reading the previous day's email upon arrival at work the following day. One morning I opened in my email and I received one from Lori H. from my unit. She's also a member of our program. Her opening line was, "Guess who's living in your house, and it isn't Goldilocks." She went on to explain that when Gil, a fellow co-worker, stopped by to check my house, there was a car in the garage. I'd left the keys in an old pickup in a machine shed, and Dale remembered the combination to that shed. At least that's how I suspect that he gained entrance. I faxed the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office with a request to have him removed from the premise because we were legally divorced. I also made sure when the deputy sheriff went to the house that Kay, Dale's daughter, and Gil, my co-worker, was also present. They went through the house and could not find him, even though his car was in the garage. Gil changed the locks on the door before leaving that day. I was emailed and informed they could not find him. So on the 14th of January, we left Turkey, headed for the United States of America. It was a sad departing because the group knew that we would never be together again. Arrived in Sioux Falls on the 16th of January to be greeted by friends and family. It was a nice homecoming, and we all went out for something to eat. Bill and his son Billy from my AA group were going to give me a ride home. The scenario I had playing out in my mind, I'd walk into the kitchen, he'd be sitting at the counter drunk, and we would have a conversation, and he would be asked to leave. Nothing in my mind prepared me for the actual events that unfolded. I opened the garage door. My eyes saw the hose leading out of the exhaust into the back seat window. Emotionally, I crashed. I went from a high of a 6-week AA sabbatical to the pavement at 1,000 miles an hour. Bill walked around to the driver's side of the vehicle and said, "Yes, he's in there." We called the Lincoln County Sheriff, and the dispatcher informed us he was in LENNOX and told us where to meet. That is the only time in my life when my stomach shook violently and the rest of my body was not in motion. When we drove down the road, I remember saying to Bill, if there would magically appear a double shot of whiskey on this dash, I would drink it. Bill said, "No, you wouldn't." I said, "Yes, I'm afraid I would." When we arrived in town, I called Deanne and told her what had happened and asked what funeral home she wanted to use. I believe she knew a call of this type would come someday, and she immediately gave me the answer. She and Dale had 5 children together. I knew they needed closure, and it was the right thing to do in a situation that had numerous wrongs attached to it. I didn't stay at my home that evening. In fact, I think it took a couple of days to return. When I did return home, my dad came to stay with me, and he had left to pick up my dog from a friend who had kept her while I was gone. I went into the bedroom, flipped up my pillow, and there were 2 letters that slipped out, one addressed to me and the other to his daughter, Kay. I lost it. I yelled to no one because no one was there. There are letters. Do you know what I did? I went into the living room and vacuumed. I looked out my front room window, and into my yard drove his 4 daughters. I ran to the door and said, "There are letters." I don't even know if they could understand what I was saying, but they followed me into the bedroom, and we read them. At the wake, the family and friends were divided into 2 groups. Dale's best friend since high school was standing there, and I walked over and shook his hand and gave him my condolences. I looked up and immediately discovered who Mike had been talking to, and it was Kevin. He looked me square in the eye and said, "I want to thank you for all you've done for my family." It took a big man to say those words. In affairs, everybody gets hurt. Got through the funeral, then my defense was to get hard. He made his own decision. He had choices just like the rest of us. The Blue Book tells us at certain times we need outside help. This was one of those times. I sought counseling at the Vets Center, and my counselor's name was Mike. In my first session, Mike said to me, "What could you have done to save this man?" And I broke down and cried like I had not yet cried. He said, "The answer to that question is nothing. The highest suicide rate is between men 50 and 55 who are recently divorced and alcoholic." After my counseling session had ended at a much later date, I figured out relationships are good and bad. When you want to free the memory of a relationship, you have to accept the good and the bad. You just can't focus on the negative. When I accepted the relationship in its entirety, I was able to let it go. Dale was a good man who had a disease called alcoholism. As our book tells us, this disease is a rapacious creditor. I felt Dale in the house. I called it the presence. And when I'd leave, lights would be on in every room so it wouldn't be dark when I returned home. One night, I was talking to my sister and she asked me, "Are you going to be able to keep living there?" My answer was, "I don't know." Earlier in my talk, I mentioned how God intervenes in my life when I ask and when I don't. This was a don't time. Long about February, a letter came from Russ. He was back in the States, stationed at K.I. Sawyer, Michigan. He said, "I'm getting out of the Air Force in April, and I'm not ready to integrate back into my family. I was wondering if I could come to South Dakota and bunk in with you." I agreed. I sometimes think God must have a very big computer to keep the needs of all of us separate. Russ arrived at the end of April in 1994. He found work, and his being in South Dakota was a blessing I didn't even know I needed. The irony of the situation is, if I'd ever had a son, he'd have been Russ. We have similar personalities and the same type of humor. A couple of years went by, and Russ came to me and said, "I think it's time I move home." I said, "I think so too." Then Russ said, "Will you be all right out here on this acreage all alone?" I said, "Russ, I will be fine. You need to go home because that's where you belong." Then when we were sitting at my kitchen counter, he got a little misty-eyed and said, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. Don't know if I'd have made it without you." I got a little misty-eyed myself and said, "Russ, you don't know how I needed you at the time you arrived. Let's just say our higher power knew what was best for both of us, and we didn't have a clue." I would like to take this opportunity to thank Russ's mother, Mary Jane Gately, for flying out from Connecticut to join me for your wonderful fellowship weekend. We have our biological family, but once in this program, our family becomes broad and inclusive, like Mary Jane flying out to be here with us this weekend. A neighbor and program lady named Shirley G. was over for coffee, and we were sitting at my counter talking when the phone rings. It's Mary Lee. Now, she grew up in Vermont, and we were Army cubicle mates for 18 months. She even took leave in the 1960s to come to South Dakota with me to visit my family. The last time we'd seen one another was May of 1962 when we said our goodbyes. But we always did the annual Christmas card and caught up on one another's lives. The only person I ever did a ninth step was Mary Lee. Imagine my surprise when she wrote back and told me she was in the program too. Now, she informs me she is calling from Sioux City and asked if I would be home the following day because they'd like to stop by for a cup of coffee. The next day, they pull into my yard. Now, mind you, this is August of 1997, and the last time we laid eyes on one another was May of 1962. We looked a little different than from in our trolling days. I, of course, fared much better than her. I met Bruce for the first time, and we hit it right off from the very start. The first time they went into Sioux Falls, I informed them to stay off of 41st Street because it's a busy street. That evening, they laughingly told me that 41st Street was a breeze compared to Boston. One night after supper, Bruce said to me, "Kay, we like it around here. Instead of heading on to Colorado, we were wondering if we could bunk in with you until we get ourselves relocated." That was fine by me. I had help with the hog chores. We got along great, and when I left on deployment, there was somebody to look after the place. Bruce always said, nothing teaches a man humility more than shoveling hog manure in a northwest wind. Think he had something there. Everything moves on, and in March of 1998, Bruce and Mary Lee found a house in Centerville. In August of 1999, I was sitting at my counter drinking coffee. I gotta quit sitting at that counter. The phone rings, and it's Sue Yu. Hadn't heard from her in a long time, but I was not surprised because Sue will stay in touch, but not frequently. So we caught up on our lives, and then she asked a question. I have to move back to Sioux Falls from here on, and I have to be to my job in 10 days. I was wondering if I could bunk in with you till I can find a place in Sioux Falls. Now, mind you, Sue came with an attachment called teenagers and teenage girls at that. Now, you must realize that menopause and puberty do not mix. I coughed, sputtered, and said, I got to think about that. I remember calling Mary Y., who I sponsored, and asked her opinion, and she said, well, Kay, it isn't going to be forever, and I think you can do it. So I called Sue back and agreed to this arrangement. I remember we had a lot of snow and ice that winter, and I was walking out to my barn for chores, and I turned around, and Sue was walking alongside of me. Now, I'm 59 years old at the time. I said, where are you going? She said, well, I just don't want you to fall and break a hip. Apparently, I looked older than my 59 years. One night, Kayla, the younger of the two daughters, thought I had too much gray in my hair and we could do a little dye job. I agreed. So one night after supper, we proceeded with this task. The color on the outside of the box was a beautiful reddish brown. We got finished. I took a shower and went to bed. Now I'm at the age where you go to the bathroom during the night. When I got up and passed the mirror, I looked at myself. My God, I looked like a match. The next day at work, the guy said, what happened to you? The best defense is offense, so I said, what do you mean? My boss walked into my office with a semblance of a grin on his face. Sergeant Langen, the regulations state natural hair color. What is that? I said, Chief, it will be taken care of this evening. The short time they bunked in lasted 13 months. Was it perfect? Not by a long shot. But the teenagers and I managed not to kill one another. Life on life's terms. In February of 2003, I was sitting at my counter drinking coffee. I gotta quit sitting at that counter. The phone rings. It was Perry V. He had been a member of my AA group and put together almost 7 years of sobriety. He went back out, ended up in jail, and wrote me a letter, and I wrote back. He was calling me on a cell phone, and I found out he was using a deputy sheriff's phone as he was walking to my place from Sioux Falls. Now, I live 25 miles from town. So I went and picked him up and brought him back home. He bunked in from February to April when he proceeded to go back out. Drinking is not an option if you're bunking in with me. Earlier, I mentioned a lady by the name of Mary Y., who I sponsor. I was at a friend's house in 1989, and we were drinking coffee and talking when Mary dropped by, and she'd been drinking. Mary was part of our social group, and I knew that she seemed to get drunk every time her husband went out of town. I watched as the other three women were running after her. She went from the kitchen out the front steps and back again. I finally just went into the living room, sat down, read a magazine when she came through again. She looked at me with a scowl on her face as if to say, why aren't you in my entourage? I didn't say a word, just kept on reading. Truth is, I don't do entourages. A few months later after this incident, I'm sitting in my office and the phone rings. It's Mary Y. She wants to ask me a question. And that question is, would I be her sponsor? Apparently, someone at the meeting told her to pick the person she disliked the most and ask that person to be her sponsor. That would have been me. I agreed under one condition, that Sheila Kay, who lived in Sioux Falls, would co-sponsor her because I was long distance and I knew she would use that as an excuse not to call me. Mary Y. celebrated 16 years of sobriety in March of this year. In June of 2004, I was going through a tough time. Anything physically I tried to accomplish wouldn't work. Mentally, I was out of sorts, and even with my friends, there was no connection. Spiritually, I have absolutely no idea where I was. One morning, I was in the barn grooming the horses when the song Whiskey Lullaby by Brad Paisley and Alison Krauss came on the radio. I heard this line, he put the bottle to his head and pulled the trigger. I remember experiencing emotions that were undefinable. I wanted to scream and be quiet. I wanted to run and wanted to be still at the same time. Someone once told me that life is a circle and every traumatic event places an X on the circle of your life. You will always come back to the X's of your life, and each time you do, it is done with either more or less intensity. For whatever reason, this was definitely a more intense time. Somehow, some way, that difficult time passed. Our program teaches us, and this too shall pass. June of 1997, my trail riding friend Marilyn and I went on an all-women's trail ride out around Dallas, South Dakota. It was a 3-day ride, and on Saturday evening, a cowboy poet from Nebraska named Len M. was hired to entertain us. One of her poems was about a kid's pony, and there were quite a few misty-eyes in the audience, including mine. And that's all right, because today I've learned misty-eyed is okay. The next morning, being Sunday, they asked Lynn to hold an impromptu church service, which she did. It was a beautiful morning along the Kiapaha River. The fog was slowly lifting from the valley as the sun was coming up. Geese were flying low over the campsite, and the horses were contentedly munching hay. When the service was done, Lynn asked if we would like to form a circle and close with the Lord's Prayer. We did. And of course, you've noticed how shy and quiet I am. And because of the beauty surrounding me, I merely yelled out, "And keep coming back!" Well, the normies looked at me as if I'd lost that last flake and the bell called my brain. When Lil, the lady who accompanied Lynn, came walking over to me just grinning, "You a friend of Bill Wilson's?" I knew the code. I said, "Yes, I am." Then nodded over towards Lynn and said, "Her too?" "Yep," Lil said, "I'm her sponsor." So a friendship was born that day. The irony of this situation is this is only the second trail ride Lynn had ever been on. She's a third-generation rancher in the sandhills of Nebraska, and when she straddles a horse, there's a purpose. Ever watch the dynamics when God wants people to meet? A friendship evolved between Lynn and I. We visited that day along the trail, began corresponding by writing letters and eventually emails. In 1999, Lynn teamed up with a musician named Ed Carpenter, and they wrote a CD and book combo of women's stories along the Oregon Trail. Whenever they had a performance in my area, they would bunk in with me. On one of their visits, we were sitting around the kitchen table talking, and Deb shared this story. It impressed me so much that I have Deb's permission to share this with all of you, and it's on their latest CD, Leaders and Legends. This story was told to my dad, Jim Wilnuts, by Chief Foolscrow, Lakota medicine man. 2 dogs. A pot of coffee sat between them at the Cooney Table Cafe. Between bites of blueberry pie, they talked of the sun and of the rain. They talked of the moon and the stars. They talked of stillness and breath. They talked of good and of evil. They talked of life and of death. "I have 2 dogs inside me," spoke the elderly medicine man. My father, a rancher, sat and listened to the primal story at hand. "One dog is dark, the other is light. They growl and they show their teeth. They will fight to the death over my soul. The winner takes all, you see." "Which one is stronger?" asked my father. "Which dog will win the prize? The light or the dark? The good or the evil? Where's the heart go when it dies?" The medicine man tipped up his cup, ate another bite of his pie. "Both dogs are strong, and the fight will go on for the last remains of my life. I never asked why they exist or why I'm called to be their host, but I hold the key to the dog that wins. It's the one I feed the most." Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
I think we got a great talk going on here. Thanks for watching the channel. Taper Dave here. Just curious, do you think this is better than Zoom? Okay, this is how I prepare my drone for launching. I like to do it inside the cab of my truck so I'm not standing outside in the weather. To install the joysticks for control, up and down, right and left, powered on. I have an Android phone that I use to connect it to the drone with. And it's actually controlled through the iPhone, through an app. Oops, wrong way. It's actually controlled through the iPhone, or through this Android phone, through the app. It's actually controlled through the Android phone, through an app, and you connect it through this short connection right here.
Remote control connected.
Remote control's connected. So I pull out the drone. I have to extend the legs. Long legs extended first, then the short legs. Remove the gimbal protector. Set that aside, then power it on one short burst, then one long burst. I lay it down. So I have to go to calibrate. So the drone's not connected yet. It shows you here as this drone gets disconnected, even though the remote's powered on. So the drone has to establish it's connected. So I go into the app to calibration mode. First I'll calibrate the remote controller. Start calibration. Out, in, out, in, up, down, and then this little wheel is to control the gimbal. So it's calibrated. Go to gimbal calibration, start calibration, and then it calibrates the gimbal. And if that shows up, the gimbal's moving all over the place. Changes, you can see it on the video. And I'm calibrated to take off. It's acquired 7 satellites at the moment. There are 26 satellites up in the sky, which it has to acquire before you can take off. So it's connected. It's got enough satellites. This is white. I can go to press this little arrow button, swipe right to take off, and it would start the motors if I slid this to the right. But I'll wait till I get outside. Don't want to do it inside.